The autumn wind carried whispers of gossip through the dusty streets of Cedar Creek, a frontier settlement nestled in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Sarah Mae Henderson clutched her shawl tighter as she hurried past the general store, her 3-year-old daughter Emma's small hand firmly grasped in hers. The sideways glances and hushed conversations had become as familiar as the morning sun, yet they still stung with the force of a prairie rattlesnake's bite. "Mama, why do the ladies look at us funny?" Emma's innocent question pierced through Sarah's thoughts like an arrow finding its mark. Sarah knelt down to meet her daughter's curious blue eyes, the same shade as her own. "Some folks just don't understand our story yet, little bird, but that's their burden to carry, not ours." The year was 1882, and the American frontier was a place where a woman's reputation could determine her survival. Sarah had learned this harsh truth when Thomas Whitmore, her betrothed and the son of the town's most prominent banker, had called off their engagement 3 months prior. The humiliation still burned in her chest like a branding iron. Standing before the entire congregation at Sunday service, Thomas had announced that he could not, in good conscience, marry a woman who had borne a child out of wedlock, regardless of the circumstances that had led to such a situation. What Thomas and the rest of Cedar Creek's respectable society didn't know or chose to ignore was that Emma was not born from some scandalous affair. Sarah's husband, James Henderson, had been a cavalry soldier who died fighting Comanche raiders 2 years into their marriage, leaving behind a pregnant wife and very little else. The army pension was meager, and without family to fall back on, Sarah had been forced to take work wherever she could find it. When official records were lost in a fire at the territorial courthouse, she had no way to prove her marriage had been legitimate. In the eyes of the community, she had simply appeared one day with a child and no husband, and that was evidence enough for their judgment. The rejection by Thomas had been the final blow to her already fragile standing in the community. No respectable man would court her now, and even finding steady work had become increasingly difficult as business owners feared associating with someone of questionable moral character. Sarah felt as though she was slowly suffocating under the weight of their collective disapproval. As mother and daughter made their way toward the small cabin they rented on the outskirts of town, Sarah noticed a commotion near the trading post. A group of Apache warriors had come to town for their monthly trade, led by a man whose presence seemed to command respect, even from those who viewed his people with suspicion and fear. She had seen him before during these trading visits, though they had never spoken. He was tall for an Apache, with broad shoulders and an unmistakable dignity in his bearing that set him apart from both his companions and the white settlers who watched him warily. His name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in his native tongue, though the whites who dealt with him had taken to calling him William, a name he accepted with the same stoic grace he showed toward most of the white man's customs. At 32 years old, he had earned his place as a respected warrior and hunter among his people, though he had never taken a wife. Some whispered it was because his heart had been broken by a young Apache woman who had died of the white man's diseases before they could marry. Others believed he was simply too particular, too proud to settle for anything less than a perfect match. The truth was more complicated than either explanation suggested. Ayana possessed a gift that few of his people understood and even fewer appreciated. He could see beyond the surface of things, beyond the masks that people wore to hide their true selves. It was the ability that had served him well as a warrior and negotiator, but it had also left him isolated in matters of the heart. Every woman he had encountered, Apache or otherwise, had seemed to him like an open book whose story he could read at a glance. There had been no mystery, no depth that called to his soul. That changed the moment he saw Sarah Henderson struggling with a bolt of fabric that had tumbled from her arms near the trading post steps. As the heavy cloth unrolled across the dusty ground, Emma began to cry. Overwhelmed by what she sensed was another small disaster in their increasingly difficult life. Sarah knelt quickly, trying to gather the fabric while soothing her daughter, her face flushed with embarrassment as she felt the eyes of both whites and Apaches upon her. The fabric was for a dress she had been commissioned to sew, one of the few ways she could still earn money in a town that had largely turned its back on her. Without hesitation, Ayana stepped forward and began helping her collect the scattered material. His movements were deliberate and respectful, careful not to let the fabric touch the ground more than necessary. As their hands briefly touched while reaching for the same corner of cloth, Sarah felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name. She looked up to find herself staring into the most remarkable eyes she had ever seen, dark as night, yet somehow filled with an inner light that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Ayana nodded solemnly, but there was something in his expression that suggested their brief encounter had affected him as well. As he handed her the last piece of fabric, their eyes met again, and in that moment, both of them felt the earth shift slightly beneath their feet. The other Apache warriors exchanged glances among themselves, recognizing something significant in their leader's behavior, while the white townspeople watched with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. It was one thing for the Indians to come to town for trade, but quite another for one of them to show such attention to a white woman, especially one already considered questionable by local standards. Thomas Whitmore happened to be emerging from the bank at that very moment, and his face darkened as he witnessed the interaction. "Sarah," he called out sharply, his voice carrying the authority he believed his family's position in the community afforded him. "I trust you're not causing any disturbances." Sarah's cheeks burned with fresh humiliation, but before she could respond, Ayana straightened to his full height and fixed Thomas with a stare that could have frozen the Rio Grande. There was no threat in his posture, nothing that could be construed as aggressive, yet something in his bearing made Thomas take an involuntary step backward. "The lady dropped her belongings," Ayana said in English that was precise and carefully modulated. "I helped her retrieve them. In my culture, this is what we call courtesy." The implied criticism in his words was subtle but unmistakable, and Thomas's face reddened as several onlookers chuckled quietly. Unable to think of a suitable response that wouldn't make him appear even more foolish, he retreated into the bank with what dignity he could muster. Sarah found herself both grateful for Ayana's intervention and mortified that her personal troubles had become public entertainment. She gathered Emma closer and hurried away from the trading post, but not before stealing one last glance at the Apache warrior who had come to her aid. He was watching her retreat with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, and she felt her cheeks grow warm under his gaze. That night, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed in their small cabin, her daughter surprised her with an observation that was far too mature for her 3 years. "Mama, that Indian man looked at you like Papa used to look at you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Emma had been barely more than a baby when James died, yet somehow she had retained memories of her parents' love that Sarah had thought were lost forever. "What do you mean, little bird?" "Like you were the most beautiful thing in the whole world," Emma said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Like looking at you made him happy inside." Ali, as Sarah lay in her own bed later that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind whisper through the pine trees outside, she couldn't shake the memory of Ayana's eyes or the way her heart had responded to his unexpected kindness. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something other than a fallen woman, to have a man look at her with respect rather than judgment or pity. But what possible future could there be in such thoughts? The gulf between their worlds was as vast as the canyon that cut through the territory, and even if it weren't, she had Emma to consider. Her daughter's welfare had to come before any foolish romantic notions that might flutter through her lonely heart. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, Sarah found herself dreaming of dark eyes that saw past the surface of things, and strong hands that had treated her possessions with the same care most people reserved for precious treasures. Meanwhile, in the Apache camp several miles outside of town, Ayana sat by his fire long into the night, staring into the dancing flames and trying to understand what had happened to him that day. In all his 32 years, he had never encountered a woman who had affected him so profoundly with just a glance. There had been something in Sarah Henderson's eyes, a combination of strength and vulnerability that spoke to something deep within his warrior's heart. His grandmother, a medicine woman known for her wisdom, had often told him that the heart recognizes its match long before the mind accepts the truth. She had said that when the right woman appeared, he would know her not by her beauty or her accomplishments, but by the way her spirit called to his own. At the time, he had dismissed such talk as the romantic notions of an old woman, but now he wondered if she'd been speaking prophecy rather than poetry. The complications were numerous and daunting. Sarah Henderson was a white woman living in a white community that had already rejected her for reasons he didn't fully understand. His own people would question his judgment in showing interest in someone outside their culture, especially given the tensions that still existed between the Apache and the settlers. The recent conflicts with the cavalry had left wounds that were still healing, and many of his tribe viewed any association with whites as potentially treacherous. Yet something in Sarah's eyes had spoken to him of shared understanding, of having been judged unfairly by those who should have offered support. He had seen the way the townspeople looked at her, the mixture of disdain and cruel satisfaction that people often displayed when witnessing another's downfall. It was a look he knew well, having been on the receiving end of such judgment from those who saw his people as nothing more than obstacles to progress. The next morning brought news that would change the trajectory of both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. A severe early winter storm was approaching from the north, and the territorial governor had issued a request for all able-bodied men to help with preparations and rescue efforts for isolated homesteads and travelers who might be caught in the blizzard. It was the kind of cooperative effort that temporarily bridged the gap between Apache and settler, bringing together men who might otherwise view each other as enemies. Ayana volunteered immediately, as did several other Apache warriors. They had extensive knowledge of the mountain passes and survival techniques that could prove invaluable in harsh conditions. The irony was not lost on him that he might find himself working alongside some of the same men who viewed him with suspicion during peaceful times. As the mixed group of rescuers organized their efforts, word came that Sarah Henderson and her young daughter were among those in potential danger. Their cabins sat in an exposed location that would bear the full brunt of the storm's fury, and with no man to help with preparations, they were particularly vulnerable. Thomas Whitmore, when asked if he intended to offer assistance to his former fiancée, had made it clear that he considered her situation to be the natural consequence of her poor choices. If she wanted protection from storms, she should have thought of that before she let herself become an outcast, he had said, with the cold certainty of a man who had never faced real hardship. Several other men from town expressed similar sentiments, and it became clear that Sarah and Emma would be left to face the storm alone unless someone took individual responsibility for their welfare. The silence that followed this realization was heavy with collective shame, though none of the men seemed willing to break it. That was when Ayana stepped forward. "I will see to the woman and child," he announced in a tone that brooked no argument. "My horse can carry supplies, and I know how to prepare a dwelling for severe weather." The other men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Having an Apache warrior take responsibility for a white woman's safety when her own community had abandoned her was a situation that challenged their understanding of social hierarchy and racial boundaries. Yet none of them seemed willing to volunteer for the task themselves, and the practical reality was that Ayana probably had more relevant skills for the situation than any of them. Sheriff McKendrick, a practical man who valued results over protocol, nodded his approval. "That settles it then. Ayana, you take whatever supplies you need and get out to the Henderson place. Make sure they're prepared to weather this storm." As Ayana loaded his horse with firewood, food, and other necessities, he found himself both nervous and excited about the prospect of spending extended time in Sarah's company. The storm was expected to last at least 3 days, which meant he would likely need to remain at the cabin to ensure their safety throughout its duration. It would be the longest time he had ever spent in close quarters with a white woman, and certainly the first time under circumstances that would require him to take a protective role. The ride to Sarah's cabin took him through terrain he knew well, past landmarks that held significance in Apache history and legend. As he traveled, he found himself thinking about the stories his grandmother had told him about love that transcended boundaries, about hearts that recognized their mates regardless of the obstacles that stood between them. He had always assumed such tales were metaphorical, designed to teach lessons about perseverance and faith. Now he wondered if they might be more literal than he had ever imagined. Sarah was in her garden, desperately trying to harvest the last of her winter vegetables before the storm arrived. When she heard the sound of approaching hooves, she straightened up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt her heart skip several beats when she recognized Ayana riding toward her cabin. He dismounted with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize all his movements and stood for a moment, taking in the sight of her wind-blown hair and dirt-stained apron. To him, she had never looked more beautiful than she did at that moment. Her cheeks flushed with exertion and her eyes bright with the kind of determined spirit that had allowed her to survive in a hostile world. "Mrs. Henderson," he said formally, though something in his voice suggested depths of feeling beneath the proper words. "I have come to help you prepare for the storm. The men in town are concerned about your safety." Sarah almost laughed at the lie, but she appreciated his diplomatic way of explaining his presence. She had no illusions about the town's concern for her welfare, but she was grateful enough for help not to question the motivation behind it. "That's very kind," she replied, then hesitated before adding, "I'm afraid I don't know your name. I mean, your real name." "I am called Ayana," he said, and something in the way he pronounced it made the name sound like music. "It means eternal blossom." "That's beautiful," Sarah said softly, then caught herself blushing at the personal nature of the comment. "I mean, it's a beautiful name." "And you are Sarah May," he replied, surprising her with his knowledge of her full name. The Meadow Princess. The fact that he had taken the time to learn not just her name, but its meaning touched something deep within her heart. It had been so long since anyone had treated her with such consideration that she had almost forgotten how it felt to be valued as an individual rather than judged as a category. Emma chose that moment to emerge from the cabin, drawn by the sound of voices. She stopped short when she saw Ayana, her young eyes taking in his appearance with the frank curiosity that children often display. Unlike the adults in town, she showed no fear or prejudice, only interest in this new person who had come to visit. "Are you the man who helped Mama yesterday?" she asked with typical 3-year-old directness. "I am," Ayana replied gravely, as if her question deserved the same serious consideration he would give to any adult inquiry. Emma nodded approvingly. "Mama said you were very nice. Are you going to help us with the big windstorm?" "I am going to try," he promised, and something in his voice made both Sarah and Emma feel safer than they had in months. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah watched in amazement as Ayana transformed their modest cabin into a fortress capable of withstanding the approaching blizzard. He reinforced the shutters, banked snow and earth against the foundation for extra insulation, and chopped enough firewood to last them well beyond the storm's predicted duration. His movements were economical and purposeful, and it was clear that he had extensive experience with extreme weather survival. More impressive than his practical skills, however, was the way he interacted with Emma. He spoke to her with the same respect he showed her mother, never talking down to her or dismissing her questions as childish nonsense. When she showed him her collection of carved wooden animals, he examined each one with genuine interest and even suggested improvements to her imaginary stories about their adventures. "You have a gift for seeing the spirits in things," he told her solemnly as she explained how her wooden horse could fly over mountains when the moon was full. "That is a valuable ability. You should nurture it." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched the interaction. James had been a loving father, but he had been away so much with the cavalry that Emma had few memories of having a man show such patient attention to her childish concerns. The sight of her daughter blossoming under Ayana's gentle guidance was almost more than Sarah's bruised heart could bear. As evening approached and the first snowflakes began to fall, Ayana made preparations to settle in for the long storm ahead. He arranged his bedroll near the fireplace in a position that would allow him to tend the fire throughout the night while remaining respectfully distant from Sarah and Emma's sleeping area. The cabin was small enough that the arrangement still felt intimate, but he managed it in a way that preserved everyone's dignity and comfort. Over dinner, which Sarah had prepared from supplies Ayana had brought along with his own emergency rations, conversation flowed more easily than either of them had expected. Sarah found herself telling him about her life before James's death, about her dreams of teaching school and her love of books and learning. Ayana shared stories of his childhood, his training as a warrior, and his deep connection to the land that his people had called home for countless generations. "I have always felt that the earth speaks to those who know how to listen," he said, as they sat by the fire after Emma had fallen asleep. "But white men seem to hear only what they want to hear." Sarah considered this carefully. "I think it's fear," she said finally. "Fear of things they don't understand, fear of losing control. When people are afraid, they often become deaf to anything that challenges their certainty." Ayana looked at her with new respect. It was a remarkably perceptive observation, especially coming from someone who belonged to the culture he was criticizing. "You speak with wisdom," he said, "but how did you learn to see past the blindness of your own people?" Sarah's smile held more sadness than humor. "When you become an outcast yourself, you start to see how arbitrary the boundaries really are. I learned that respectability and righteousness are not the same thing, and that sometimes the people who claim to represent morality are the least moral of all." The storm struck with full force just after midnight, and for the next 3 days, the world outside their cabin ceased to exist. The wind howled with the voice of banshees, and snow piled against their walls until the windows were completely blocked. Inside, however, warmth and a strange kind of peace reigned. Ayana proved to be an excellent storyteller, entertaining Emma with tales of Coyote the Trickster and other figures from Apache mythology. He taught her simple words in his native language and showed her how to weave grass into small baskets. Sarah found herself drawn into these activities as well, and she began to remember what it felt like to be part of a family again. On the second night, as they sat close to the fire while the storm raged outside, Sarah found the courage to ask Ayana about his own life. "Have you never married? Never wanted a family of your own?" He was quiet for so long that she began to regret the personal nature of the question. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were revealing secrets he had never shared with anyone. "I was told once by my grandmother that I would know my true mate by the way her spirit called to mine," he said, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "She said it would not matter what tribe she came from or what obstacles stood between us, because the heart recognizes truth even when the mind rebels against it." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "And has your heart ever recognized such truth?" Ayana turned to look at her then, and the expression in his dark eyes made her feel as though the cabin had suddenly become much warmer. "It has," he said quietly. "Recently." The weight of unspoken words hung between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah felt as though she was standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that whatever happened next would change her life forever. Part of her wanted to step back, to retreat into the safety of solitude and accepted loneliness. But a larger part of her, a part that had been sleeping since James's death, was awakening to possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "Ayana," she whispered, his name feeling like a prayer on her lips. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently touched her face with fingertips that were rough from years of outdoor living, yet tender beyond measure. "Sarah May," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like the most beautiful word in any language. What happened next was as natural as sunrise after the longest night. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tentative and certain, a question and an answer all at once. Sarah felt years of loneliness and heartache melting away under the warmth of his touch, while Ayana experienced the profound joy of finding the missing piece of his soul that he had been searching for all his life. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and Sarah could see her own wonder reflected in Ayana's eyes. "This is impossible," she whispered, though she made no move to put distance between them. "Many things seem impossible until they happen," he replied, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. "Is it more impossible than a woman raising a child alone in a hostile town? Is it more impossible than an Apache warrior finding love with a white woman during a blizzard?" Sarah laughed despite herself, recognizing the truth in his words. "When you put it like that, it almost sounds reasonable. The heart has its own wisdom," Ayana said. "Perhaps we should trust it to guide us." Over the remaining hours of the storm, they talked until dawn, about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears with the kind of openness that usually takes years to develop. Sarah learned that Ayana had taught himself to read English and that he shared her love of books and learning. He discovered that she had always been fascinated by other cultures and that her isolation from her own community had made her more open to different ways of seeing the world. By the time the storm finally broke and sunlight streamed through the cabin windows for the first time in 3 days, both of them knew that something profound and irreversible had occurred. They had found in each other not just romantic love, but a true meeting of minds and spirits that transcended the barriers their respective societies had erected. The challenge now would be figuring out how to build a life together in a world that would view their union as everything from scandalous to impossible to dangerous. But as they stood together at the window, watching the storm clouds dissipate and the sun paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, neither of them doubted that they would find a way. Emma, who had awakened to find the adults standing close together and looking happier than she had seen her mother in months, made an announcement that surprised them both with its mature understanding of the situation. "Are you going to be my new papa?" she asked Ayana with the directness that only children can manage. Ayana knelt down to meet her eyes, just as Sarah had done outside the general store what felt like a lifetime ago. "Would you like me to be?" he asked seriously. Emma considered this carefully. "Will you teach me more stories and show me how to make those grass baskets and help Mama not be sad anymore?" "I will do all of those things and more," Ayana promised, "if your mama agrees." Emma looked expectantly at Sarah, who felt tears of joy sliding down her cheeks as she nodded her agreement. In that moment, surrounded by the golden light of morning after the storm, Sarah Henderson knew that her long journey through rejection and heartache had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The return to town presented challenges that were both expected and surprising. Word of Ayana's extended stay at Sarah's cabin had spread throughout Cedar Creek, generating the kind of gossip that small communities thrive on. Some of the talk was malicious, with people like Thomas Whitmore suggesting that Sarah had fallen even further from grace by entertaining an Indian man in her home. But there was also a surprising amount of support from unexpected quarters. Mrs. Elizabeth Cordner, the elderly widow who ran the boarding house, made a point of stopping Sarah on the street to express her approval. "That Apache fellow showed more Christian charity in 3 days than the rest of this town has managed in 3 months, she declared loudly enough for several passers-by to hear. "About time someone recognized your worth, dear." Sheriff McKendrick, when pressed for his official opinion on the matter, pointed out that Ayanna had volunteered for a dangerous rescue mission when other men had declined, and that his actions had potentially saved 2 lives. "Far as I'm concerned, that makes him more of a gentleman than most of the so-called respectable men in this town," he stated flatly. Even some of the Apache community expressed cautious approval of the developing relationship. Ayanna's status as a respected warrior and his careful attention to propriety during the courtship had satisfied many of their concerns about his involvement with a white woman. The fact that Sarah had been rejected by her own people made her seem less like a potential threat to Apache culture and more like someone who might genuinely appreciate their way of life. But it was the reaction of Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served both the town and the Apache settlement, that proved most significant in legitimizing their union. A progressive man who had spent years building bridges between the 2 communities, Father Santos recognized in Ayanna and Sarah's relationship an opportunity to demonstrate that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that divided people. "I have seen many marriages in my time," he told them during a private meeting to discuss their future. "Some are based on convenience, some on obligation, some on passion that burns bright but briefly. Very few are based on the kind of deep understanding and mutual respect that I see between you 2. If you are certain of your commitment to each other and to the challenges you will face, I would be honored to perform your wedding ceremony." The ceremony itself became a symbol of hope for those who believed in the possibility of harmony between cultures. It took place outdoors, in a meadow between the town and the Apache settlement, with guests from both communities in attendance. Sarah wore a dress of soft blue wool that she had sewn herself, decorated with intricate beadwork that Ayanna's female relatives had contributed as a wedding gift. Ayanna wore traditional Apache wedding garments combined with a white shirt that represented his willingness to bridge both worlds. Emma served as both flower girl and ring bearer, her joy at finally having a complete family radiating from her small face like sunlight. As she walked down the makeshift aisle, scattering wildflower petals, more than one guest found themselves moved to tears by the simple beauty of the moment. The wedding vows themselves reflected the unique nature of their union, along with traditional promises to love and honor each other. Ayanna and Sarah pledged to serve as bridges between their respective communities, to raise their children with appreciation for both cultures, and to prove through their example that differences could be a source of strength rather than division. "I promise to see you always as you truly are, not as others might label you," Sarah vowed, her voice clear and steady as she looked into Ayanna's eyes. "I promise to stand beside you in facing whatever challenges our love might bring, and to trust in the wisdom of the heart that brought us together." Ayanna's vows were equally moving. "I promise to protect not just your body and your child, but your dreams and your spirit," he declared. "I promise to honor the strength that has carried you through your darkest times, and to help you build a future worthy of that strength." When Father Santos pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that arose from the mixed crowd was genuine and heartfelt. Even some of those who had initially disapproved of the match found themselves caught up in the emotion of the moment and the obvious joy of the newly married couple. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Cedar Creek had ever seen. Apache drums mingled with fiddle music, and traditional tribal foods were served alongside familiar frontier fare. Children from both communities played together without the self-consciousness that often marked adult interactions, offering hope for a more integrated future. Thomas Whitmore made a brief appearance at the celebration, drawn perhaps by curiosity or a sense that history was being made. He stood apart from the festivities, watching with an expression that mixed regret with something that might have been recognition of his own loss. When Sarah noticed him, she felt no anger or triumph, only a kind of sad understanding that some people were simply not capable of seeing past their own limitations. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if he had been more open-minded?" Ayana asked, having followed her gaze. Sarah considered the question seriously before shaking her head. "I think everything happened exactly as it was meant to," she said. "If Thomas had married me, I would have been trapped in a life that denied my true nature. I would have been expected to be grateful for his acceptance, while hiding every part of myself that didn't fit his narrow definition of respectability. With you, I can be completely myself." Ayana smiled and pulled her closer for a dance as the mixed musical ensemble launched into a spirited version of a traditional wedding waltz. "And I can be completely myself with you," he replied, "including the parts of myself that my own people sometimes find too curious about the white world." As the evening wore on and the celebration continued under a canopy of stars, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejection that had once seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of her real life. The shame and isolation she had endured had stripped away all the pretenses and expectations that might have prevented her from recognizing true love when it appeared. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. There were still those in both communities who viewed their union with suspicion or outright hostility. Sarah faced occasional snubs from women who considered her marriage to an Apache to be the final proof of her moral failings, while Ayana sometimes encountered criticism from Apache traditionalists who questioned his loyalty to their people. But for every closed door, another seemed to open. Sheriff McKendrick hired Ayana as a deputy, recognizing that his skills as a tracker and his knowledge of both cultures made him invaluable for maintaining peace in the territory. Sarah began taking in sewing from a wider area as word spread that she was skilled with needle and thread and reasonable in her prices. Some customers came specifically because they admired her courage in following her heart, despite social pressure. Emma thrived in their blended household, learning Apache legends alongside fairy tales, picking up words in both languages with the ease that only children possess. She became something of a bridge herself, moving comfortably between both communities and helping other children overcome their initial wariness about cultural differences. The arrival of their first child together, a son they named James after Sarah's first husband, and two bears after Ayana's grandfather, seemed to solidify their acceptance in both communities. The baby's mixed heritage was obvious from the moment of his birth, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to shift between brown and blue depending on the light. But rather than being a source of division, little James became a symbol of the possibility for harmony between peoples. As Sarah held her newborn son while Emma and Ayana slept nearby, she marveled at the twists of fate that had brought her to this place. The woman who had once been rejected as unsuitable for marriage to a banker's son had become the wife of a respected Apache warrior and deputy sheriff. The single mother who had been scorned by respectable society had found her place as a bridge between two worlds. But perhaps most significantly, the heart that had been broken and discarded had been healed by love that was deeper and more genuine than anything she had ever imagined possible. In Ayana's eyes, she saw not judgment or conditions, but complete acceptance of who she was and who she was becoming. In his arms, she had found not just passion, but peace, not just security, but adventure. Years passed, bringing more children and greater integration between the communities. Sarah and Ayana's marriage became a model for other mixed couples, proof that love could indeed transcend the boundaries that society tried to impose. Their children grew up to be bridges themselves, moving easily between worlds and helping to break down barriers through their very existence. Emma married a young Apache man who'd been educated at a white school, creating another union that defied conventional expectations. Their eldest son, James, became a lawyer who specialized in representing both Native American and white clients in territorial disputes. Their younger children continued the tradition of building bridges, becoming teachers, translators, and peacemakers. But on quiet evenings when the house was full of children and grandchildren, Sarah would sometimes look across the dinner table at her husband and remember that moment in the storm when everything changed. She would see in his eyes the same depth of love and understanding that had first captured her heart, and she would marvel again at the wisdom of following her heart rather than the expectations of others. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Ayana looked puzzled by the question. "Regret what? Choosing me? Choosing a life that has sometimes been harder than it had to be?" He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their decades together. "Sarah May," he said, using the full version of her name that he reserved for their most intimate moments. "Choosing you was the easiest decision I ever made. Everything else was just details we had to work out along the way." Sarah smiled, remembering a 3-year-old girl who had once observed that an Apache warrior looked at her mother the way her father used to look at her. Emma, now a grandmother herself, had possessed wisdom beyond her years in recognizing the signs of true love, the heart that sees beyond judgment, beyond fear, beyond the artificial barriers that society constructs, had guided them all to exactly where they needed to be. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky and the sounds of their extended family echoed from inside the house, Sarah Henderson Two Bears reflected on the profound truth that had shaped her life. Sometimes what appears to be rejection is actually redirection, guiding us away from what we thought we wanted toward what we truly needed. The woman who had once believed that her worth depended on the approval of others had learned that real value comes from being seen and loved for who you truly are. The mother who had feared that her child would grow up without the security of a father's protection had watched that child flourish under the guidance of a man who loved her not because he had to, but because he chose to. And the heart that had been deemed unworthy by those who claimed to understand love had found its perfect match in someone who saw past surface differences to the soul beneath. In a world that often seemed determined to divide people into categories of us and them, Sarah and Ayana had proven that love recognizes no such boundaries. Their story became legend in the territory, passed down through generations as an example of what was possible when people chose courage over conformity, love over prejudice, and understanding over judgment. Children would hear the tale of the rejected bride and the Apache warrior who saw her true worth, and they would learn that the most beautiful love stories often begin with the darkest chapters. But for Sarah, sitting on her porch with her husband's hand in hers, and the laughter of their descendants filling the air around them, it was not a legend, but a lived reality. Every morning she woke up beside the man who had seen something in her that no one else had bothered to look for. Every day she witnessed the proof that choosing love over fear had been the right decision, no matter how difficult the path had sometimes been. The wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers across the high desert landscape, the same landscape where she had once walked alone with a small child, bearing the weight of society's judgment and wondering if she would ever find acceptance again. Now that same ground was home to a family that spanned 2 cultures, a testament to the power of love to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The years had brought unexpected prosperity to their unconventional household. Ayana's reputation as a peacekeeper had grown beyond the territorial boundaries, and he was often called upon to mediate disputes between settlers and various Native American tribes. His unique position as someone who understood both worlds intimately made him invaluable to territorial governors and tribal councils alike. Sarah had established herself as the finest seamstress in a three-county area, her skill with intricate beadwork and traditional Apache designs making her services sought after by brides from both cultures. Their children had grown into remarkable individuals who carried forward the legacy of bridge building that their parents had begun. Emma, now married and a mother herself, had become a teacher who specialized in bilingual education, helping Apache children learn English while preserving their native language and customs. James, their eldest son, had not only become a lawyer, but had been elected to the territorial legislature, where he championed laws protecting the rights of both settlers and Native Americans. Their daughter Maria worked as a translator for the territorial court system, ensuring that Apache defendants received fair trials, while their youngest son David had followed in his father's footsteps as a deputy sheriff with a particular talent for tracking and wilderness survival. But perhaps their greatest achievement was not in their individual successes, but in the way their family had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear, understanding over prejudice. Other mixed marriages in the territory often looked to Sarah and Ayana as proof that such unions could not only survive, but thrive. The couple found themselves serving as unofficial counselors and mentors to young people from both communities who faced similar challenges in following their hearts across cultural boundaries. One particular case had touched them deeply just the previous spring. A young Apache woman named Little Dove had fallen in love with a German immigrant named Klaus Müller, a hard-working blacksmith who had shown nothing but respect for Native American customs and traditions. Both families had initially opposed the match, the Apache because they feared their daughter would be lost to white society, the Germans because they worried about social ostracism from other European immigrants. Sarah and Ayana had invited both families to their home for a carefully orchestrated dinner, where they shared their own story and demonstrated through their children and grandchildren the beautiful results that could come from cultural blending. By the end of the evening, both families had given their blessing to the young couple, and Sarah had gained the satisfaction of knowing that their example was helping others find the courage to follow their hearts. The territorial capital had even commissioned Ayana to write a guide for peaceful coexistence between different cultural groups, recognizing his unique insights into the delicate balance required for harmony. Sarah had illustrated the guide with detailed drawings of traditional crafts, foods, and customs from both cultures, creating a document that was both practical and beautiful. Their influence extended beyond romantic relationships to business partnerships, educational initiatives, and even political alliances. The trading post that Ayana had helped establish had become a model for fair commerce between cultures, with prices set collaboratively and profits shared equitably. Sarah's sewing circle had evolved into a cooperative that included women from multiple tribes and ethnic backgrounds, sharing techniques and creating hybrid designs that reflected their blended community. During the harsh winter of 1889, when a severe blizzard had trapped several families in the mountains for nearly 2 weeks, it was Sarah and Ayana's network of cross-cultural relationships that had made the rescue possible. Apache tracking skills, combined with settler resources and German engineering expertise, had saved more than 30 lives, proving that diversity was not just beautiful, but essential for survival in the challenging frontier environment. The rescue operation had become the stuff of legend itself. When word reached town that the Morrison family, along with 2 other homesteading families, had not been seen since the storm began, panic had set in among the townspeople. The Morrisons had been traveling to their new claim with their 4 young children, when the blizzard struck with unprecedented fury. Search parties had gone out 3 times and returned empty-handed, defeated by whiteout conditions and treacherous terrain. It was Ayana who had proposed the unprecedented solution, a mixed rescue team combining the best skills from each community. He would lead Apache trackers who could read the land even in impossible conditions, while Klaus Müller would bring his engineering knowledge to construct emergency shelters, and Dr. Patterson, one of the few educated men in town who had always supported Sarah and Ayana's marriage, would provide medical expertise for any survivors they might find. Sarah had insisted on joining the expedition despite the danger, arguing that if they found the families alive, her nursing skills would be crucial, and her experience with emergency childbirth could prove vital since Mrs. Morrison had been heavily pregnant when the family disappeared. More practically, she pointed out that she was one of the few people who could serve as translator between the Apache trackers and the white rescuers, ensuring clear communication when every second might count. The search had taken them through terrain that would have been impassable for any single group acting alone. The Apache trackers found signs that others had missed, reading stories in broken twigs and disturbed snow that revealed the desperate journey of the lost families. Klaus's engineering skills proved invaluable when they needed to construct rope bridges across crevasses and devise pulley systems to move injured people up steep slopes. Dr. Patterson's medical knowledge saved the life of little Timothy Morrison, who had developed pneumonia from exposure, while Sarah assisted in the emergency delivery of the Morrisons' fifth child, born in a makeshift shelter carved from snow and hope. When they finally brought all 32 survivors back to town after 6 days in the wilderness, the celebration that followed became an annual tradition known as Unity Day. The rescue had demonstrated beyond any doubt that the cooperation between cultures that Sarah and Ayana represented was not just personally fulfilling, but essential for the survival and prosperity of the entire territory. The success of that rescue operation led to the establishment of the Territorial Emergency Response Cooperative, a formal organization that brought together the best skills from all cultural groups in the region. Ayana was named its first director, a position that gave him significant influence in territorial policy and further legitimized his standing in both communities. Sarah served as the organization's coordinator of medical and family services, training women from various cultural backgrounds in emergency medical techniques and child welfare protocols. Their home became an unofficial embassy where representatives from different tribes, immigrant communities, and established settler families would come to resolve disputes, negotiate trade agreements, and plan cooperative ventures. Sarah's parlor, once the humble refuge of a rejected woman and her small daughter, had transformed into a place where the future of the territory was often decided over cups of coffee and plates of cookies that reflected recipes from a dozen different cultural traditions. The territorial governor, impressed by the results of their cooperative approach, commissioned a comprehensive study of their methods. The resulting report, titled "Building Bridges: A Model for Cultural Integration in the American Frontier," was distributed to territorial administrators throughout the West and even sent to officials in Washington, D.C. as an example of successful, peaceful coexistence between diverse populations. Sarah often marveled at the irony that her greatest shame had become her greatest strength. The experience of being an outsider in her own community had given her a unique empathy for others who felt displaced or misunderstood. She could speak to the Apache women who feared losing their cultural identity in a changing world, to the immigrant families struggling to find their place in an often hostile environment, and to the settler women who sometimes felt trapped by the rigid expectations of frontier respectability. Her Thursday afternoon gatherings had evolved from simple sewing circles into forums for addressing community problems and celebrating cultural achievements. Women would bring their traditional crafts, share stories from their homelands, and work together on projects that benefited the entire territory. They had established a scholarship fund for children from all backgrounds to attend school, created a lending library that included books in multiple languages, and organized seasonal festivals that celebrated the traditions of all community members. One of Sarah's most cherished memories from those years was the day that Thomas Whitmore's own daughter, Catherine, had come to ask for her help. Catherine had fallen in love with a young Mexican vaquero named Eduardo Ramirez, and her father's predictable opposition had left her feeling desperate and alone. She had heard about Sarah's reputation as someone who helped young people navigate cultural barriers in love, and she had swallowed her pride to seek guidance from the woman her father had once rejected as unsuitable. Sarah had welcomed Catherine with the same warmth she showed to everyone who sought her help, never once mentioning the painful history between their families. Instead, she had focused on practical strategies for building family acceptance, sharing techniques for demonstrating cultural respect, and connecting Catherine with other couples who had successfully navigated similar challenges. When Catherine and Eduardo's wedding took place 2 years later, Thomas Whitmore had not only attended, but had walked his daughter down the aisle with evident pride and joy. After the ceremony, Thomas had approached Sarah with a humility that she had never seen in him before. "I owe you an apology that's about 15 years overdue," he had said quietly. "I was a fool to let you go, but I see now that it worked out exactly as it was meant to. You've become everything I was too small-minded to appreciate, and you've helped my daughter find happiness that I was too prejudiced to accept." Sarah had accepted his apology with grace, understanding that people could change and grow just as communities could evolve beyond their initial limitations. The conversation had brought healing not just to their personal relationship, but to a wound in the community that had festered for years, demonstrating once again that love and forgiveness could transform even the most entrenched animosities. As Ayana squeezed her hand and pointed out a shooting star streaking across the vast Montana sky, Sarah made a silent wish for all the lonely hearts still waiting for their own moment of recognition, their own chance to be seen and valued for who they truly were. She wished for them the courage to trust in love when it appeared, even if it came in a form they never expected, for she had learned that the heart which sees beyond judgment, beyond fear, beyond the narrow confines of what others deem acceptable, is the heart that finds true happiness. And in a world full of people afraid to cross the bridges that connect different shores, sometimes it takes just 2 brave souls to prove that love is the strongest bridge of all. The story of Sarah Mae Henderson and Ayana Two Bears would be told and retold for generations, growing richer with each telling, inspiring countless others to look beyond the surface and see the beauty that lies beneath. But the real magic was not in the telling but in the living, not in the legend but in the daily choice to love without conditions, to see without prejudice, and to believe that every heart deserves to be recognized for its true worth. In the end, that was the greatest gift the Apache warrior had given the rejected bride, and she had given him in return. Not just love, but the recognition that they were each exactly who they were meant to be, and that together they could create something more beautiful than either could have imagined alone. Under the endless sky of the American frontier, surrounded by the family their love had created and the community their courage had transformed, they had found their forever home in each other's hearts.